So as you are getting logged onto the webinar, for those of you who have not attended a webinar previously, we are not able to see you. This is not like a typical Zoom meeting. So you are able to log on and see our presentation and just see the panelists. When you sign into the chat, only the panelists can see that. Those of us from Interboro and our presenter, Trish, who I will be introducing in a moment. So if you could please sign into the chat with your name, the name of your child, and the name of the community school your child attends, just for attendance purposes, that would be wonderful. And this event is, one of the many in our series of parent engagement events, sponsored by our Title I programs and putting your Best Buck Forward series. So we thank you for joining us. The Q&A part of the Zoom webinar will be used for questions, and they will be seen by everyone. So if you type a question, everyone will be able to see it. And those of us from Interboro will be monitoring that throughout the evening, and we will make sure that any questions are addressed at the end of the presentation. So we're really excited to have this webinar and to have Trish Caldwell joining us. She will be giving you a little background information about her, but Christine and I, well, for those of you who don't know, I'm Natalie Tozier, the counselor at Tinicum School, and I'm joined by Christine Bryan, the counselor at the Kindergarten Academy, and putting together this webinar with Trish Caldwell. And we had seen Trish present in the fall, and we thought it was really crucial to us as parents, us as educators, and we were hoping that you would feel the same way after getting to hear her presentation. And for when we do have questions and answers at the end, we're also joined by Dr. Ekman and Ms. Lambert from our administrative team, from curriculum department and pupil services. So please feel free to, enjoy the webinar and let us know if you have any questions or anything that we can help you with. So I will now turn it over to Trish Caldwell.
All right, I'm going to pull up my screen quickly. All right, can everybody see it? Is it full screen, or are you able to see the sidebar and the main screen?
Sidebar and the main screen.
Okay, so let's do that better. Better?
Yes, there we go.
Okay. All right, so I want to first thank you for having me and inviting me to be a part of this conversation, because as a person that has worked in the field of behavioral health and substance use for almost 25-ish years, I think this topic is an incredibly important one to be having, but also as a parent of a child who has also been diagnosed with ADHD. I can't tell you how many times in my life as I was kind of navigating her as she kind of continued through her own schooling. She is 24 years old today and doing well and engaged in all of these wonderful opportunities. There were so many times that as she was growing up, I was grateful that I was in the field that I was, because what it allowed for me was to have a much better understanding of how ADHD impacts an individual and a child as they go through the school systems. So there was a lot of gratitude as I kind of navigated through this, because, and I remember talking to another parent who had another child that had ADHD who was struggling, and the child was struggling and the parents were struggling. And I remember leaving that conversation and really saying, there, for the grace of God, like, it's one of those things, I'm just so grateful that I knew this, that I had been in the field, and I wasn't a better mom, and I wasn't a better person, and I wasn't more knowledgeable because I had chosen to be. I just happened to be in a profession that it allowed me to know more in the moment. And so that's really what kind of sparked this conversation, where I started speaking to schools or speaking to detention centers or speaking in regards to community events and those that are impacted by substance use, because I was really appreciating that we are all, at the end of the day, trying to do the best that we can. And this is a topic that does not oftentimes get discussed. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So I want to really genuinely thank you for having me, because I think it is such an important conversation for us to be having, to really figure out, particularly as our children are young, because we start to set the tone of what it's going to look like for them as they continue to get older. So again, just to make sure, we were kidding about this beforehand, to make sure that you know I am qualified to be able to do this. I have been in the field for about 27 years. I'm currently the Vice President of Family Services at Recovery Centers of America, which is a substance use treatment facility. We currently have 10 across the nation, and do a full continuum of care, including medication-assisted treatment. Having said that, I've also been working in the field in the behavioral health realm, working with adolescents and children and young adults for a long part of my career, in a lot of different areas: inpatients, outpatients, community-based programs, schools. So I have a lot of background information. So to assure you, I do know what I'm saying. Every time that I do this training, I start with this quote, because I think it's an important moment for us to pause, whether we are the teachers, the educators, whether we are, the counselors or the parents. It's incredibly important for us to pause long enough to recognize that the way that we talk to our children becomes their inner voice. So for a large part of my career, I worked with adolescents. When I worked with the adolescents who had been diagnosed or had not been diagnosed with ADHD, but certainly had the ramifications of its symptoms, when we start to look back on what were those voices that became the narrative of that child. And I'll talk a little bit about it in a minute in regards to the comorbidity that we see for somebody with ADHD in regards to depression and anxiety. But when we look at ADHD, which is oftentimes not a training that you get, which is oftentimes not something that people really have conversations about, which is oftentimes minimized as regard to, you're just coddling the baby, or you're making excuses for their behaviors. You are, condoning certain things that they are engaging in. But when we really pause to think about, there's no other diagnoses that we minimize as much as we do ADHD. If your child had had depression, you would engage in skills, you would engage in resources, and you would be working collectively with your educators, with community counselors, to get the needs met that you knew your child had. For ADHD, oftentimes we do not. And so what happens is that when they're little, and I say this all the time, every child wants to do well. It is inherently a part of who we are as a human being. And so when you are little, when you talk about little children and kindergartners, all the way up to, honestly, where I normally say the cutoff starts to change around 4th grade, where they still want to do well. But before 4th grade, everything about who they are is about trying to do well. If you are ADHD, then the voices that you start to hear are, Trish, go sit down. Go sit down. Stop touching that. Stop touching that little boy. Stop doing that. If you keep doing this, we're going to take you to recess. If you do that one more time, you're going to have to stay after school. I'm going to give you check marks. I'm going to call your mom or your father or whoever your caregiver is. Stop it. Stop doing those things. Go sit down. If you just tried harder, you would be able to do this. If you just stayed focused and finished your schoolwork, then you would be able to do these things. That becomes their inner voice. And at the age of elementary school, they're trying. And what happens is, if the voices that they're hearing outside are continuously saying, you're still not doing it right, they start to get to this magical age by 5th grade, typically to like 7th, they start to shift it and start saying, I don't even care anymore. And so you start to see behaviors escalating. In my world, in substance use, that's where I see the introduction, because in the moments that they were trying to do well, they weren't taught how to. They weren't understanding that they were attempting to do well. And so I oftentimes equate it to, if you had a child that could not read and had a visual impairment, and you put a book in front of that child in front of other children and said, read, I can't. I just told you that you need to read this book. I can't read this book. And when you start to kind of push them, what will happen is what would be natural. One of two things can happen for a child. They either internalize it, meaning there's something so wrong with me that I can't read the book. The other kids are, because we remind them, other kids are reading the same book. Like, why can't you read the book? And so the child will internalize it and say, because there's something wrong with me, because I'm stupid, because I'm not good enough, because I'm not smart. Or they attempt to try and deflect it. And so they start fighting back. I don't even care about reading. And they throw their book and they tell you off. Those are our options for our children. So I'm going to encourage you to think about it a little bit differently tonight, in the same way that you would not ask a child who had a visual impairment to read a book without making accommodations and trying to figure out how to motivate that child to do well. I'm going to encourage you to change the way that we perceive these children that have ADHD so that the messaging can be different for them. Because as I'll highlight, when they are doing well, they are superstars. So some of the myths around ADHD is overdiagnosed in the United States, which means that it's a fake diagnosis. So it is overdiagnosed. One of the areas of expertise that I also tend to speak about and treat is trauma. So it is overdiagnosed because I think there's a lot of individuals that have been impacted by trauma that we diagnose with ADHD and actually have been impacted by trauma because it can look the same. And so I do think that that occurs. Otherwise, ADHD is not a new diagnosis. We have recognized it within our country for a very long time, but I think we haven't appreciated it. And I think a lot of times people didn't recognize what it was or how it was impacting. ADHD is an excuse for bad behavior. So I'm not trying to excuse behaviors, but particularly the younger the children, the more opportunity we have in regards to teaching the behaviors that we want by supporting them getting there. So it's not an excuse for bad behaviors. We're not saying just because you have ADHD, you get to get away with things. It's a recognition, just like we don't tell a child that can't read based on a visual impairment. We're not saying we're not teaching you how to read. We're saying we're going to teach you how to read in a way that you can succeed. That's the shift with ADHD. Only hyper kids have ADHD, so we know that that is not true, although those tend to be the ones that get themselves in trouble. So they stand out a little bit easier. So there's no hiding the child that has ADHD. But the inattentive type, when you hear somebody saying they're such a daydreamer, or they don't care anymore, or they can't stay focused, they don't pay attention, then we need to look at that as we would any other symptom, because a child that isn't able to stay attentive, a child that can't stay focused, is going to have similar ramifications, particularly as they get to the older ages, middle school and high school, when you talk about things like block scheduling, when you talk about learning that is cumulative. Because if they're not able to stay focused and they are the quote unquote daydreamers, then when they're learning material that they have to pay attention to, they start to fall through the cracks. But you don't know that they are because they're not acting out behaviorally. For some parents, they will say, and again, this is like an old school, like Freudian, right? Bad parents cause ADHD. We used to hear that bad parents cause bipolar disorder. So bad parents do not cause any diagnoses. But in fairness, and as a mom who raised a daughter that had ADHD sure did cause me to parent poorly at times, because I'm a human being treating my daughter. And so there are definitely times that I wasn't a great parent in regards to her. So I didn't cause the ADHD, but the ADHD might have caused me not to be a great parent at times. And so that's a realness, because it's a handful. It's a lot to have to try and navigate and navigate through to help your child. An interesting thing, and I added this because I had done a training with Dr. Amen. So if anybody is interested in additional information, I highly recommend his books. He is a psychiatrist, a neuropsychiatrist based out of New York. He's written a lot of books. Dr. Amen does a lot of work with ADHD. And I actually saw him speak in New York, which was fantastic. And he, for the first time, and again, I felt like I was pretty experienced in ADHD. I had a pretty sound understanding. My daughter was already in high school. And he started to talk about the brain imaging of children with ADHD. And what struck me in that moment was my daughter was a very competitive athlete. She was a college bound athlete. She was a good student for the most part, other than when she decided she didn't want to engage in certain things, or certainly those cumulative classes that I talked about. But what she kept hearing from her coaches was, if you just tried a little bit harder, this is what you would be capable of. Everybody kept telling her how much potential they saw in her to be this Division I athlete, or to be this super smart child. And I watched when she would hear those things that it shut her down, but I never knew what it was. I didn't know if it was a lack of her own confidence. And when I went to this training, what he said is, when we say that to children of ADHD, it actually slows down the neural activity in the part of the brain responsible for motivation. If you did not have ADHD, so if you were to say those same things to my middle daughter, it motivated her. If they said, if you just tried a little harder, you would be doing this and this and this. And she was like, got it. I'm going to bust up and I'm going to start doing these things. But for my daughter with ADHD, what it did to the brain was actually the reverse. And that changed the way that I started to see and interact with her, let alone others. Again, I deal with higher risk behaviors than what my daughter certainly presented. But for that moment, I think that that's such a powerful thing, because when I say those words, every parent I know that has a child with ADHD is like, that's everything I've said to them. I say it to them all the time. If you just tried harder, you could do it. And here was this neuropsychiatrist saying, it shuts their brain down. Give them skills, don't give them that. Truth about ADHD, so less than half of those with it are being treated. I'm going to go through some of these slides because, again, I'm happy to share the slides. I'm a big fan of saying community information is important information. And if this is going to be something that you either take home to your family and it helps you to be a better parent, or it's going to take into the schools to help you to be able to support your students, I'm happy to share that information and can certainly send it to Natalie or Christine so that you can have access to it. So I'm not going to go over some of these slides, so I have enough time to be able to hit some of the more important ones that need a little more explaining. Here are some of the facts. So the risk factors, again, the irony in my field, as well as just in general, is that this diagnosis oftentimes has some of the highest risk behaviors associated with it. Yet, it is one of the most marginalized in treatment. So we know children have ADHD and we're like, whatever, they got ADHD. It's almost like you just said that they had the cold. They just have a cold, no big deal. But ADHD has some of the most significant risk factors. So we see higher rates of those that have untreated ADHD in regards to incarcerations, in regards to when your adolescent gets their driver's license, they're more inclined to get speeding tickets and get into car accidents. The old school ADHD individuals were ones, so when people are like, we don't have ADHD in my family, and all of a sudden you hear Uncle John never finished school, he dropped out, and you hear all these things that you go, oh, that was where it was. 52%, so half of them develop a substance use disorder when they get older. And so that is worth a consistent conversation in regards to what experimentation looks like for your child. How do you support a dialogue that allows for them to understand their risks while still making decisions for themselves? And young girls have higher rates of sexual assault or teenage pregnancy. And again, we'll talk a little bit about why, but that time that I had mentioned the comorbidity, 75% are having that comorbidity in regards to depression, anxiety, or family chaos. And so that becomes an important reason, all of these are, for us to pay attention to what we can do a little bit different. So I will say this, I say to every single person I work with, the reality is that ADHD is a superpower. I wish I had it in hindsight. That if you think of the brain as a muscle, somebody with ADHD, their brain is in the gym all the time, right? So when my brain gets tired and I eventually crash on the couch and just want to veg and watch TV, the brain of somebody with ADHD is still thinking through it. So when it is channeled, we tend to see these outrageously successful athletes and CEOs, community organizers. They are, creative in their outlets in regards to musicians. So there's this beauty to what ADHD has. But what I will say is ADHD is not a diagnosis that can be ignored. So what I normally say to families is ADHD is either going to manage you or you will manage it. And it is a spectrum disorder. So it is one that some people will have a low level of some of the engaging behaviors and some will have a high. The environmental factors also play a pretty significant role in the way that it presents itself. Chaos tends to increase the behavioral symptoms associated with ADHD. So sometimes if there's a lot of internal chaos or if there's family conflict, that child is more likely to present with higher levels of symptoms than a child that did not have ADHD. So they are going to. So I always say, right, there's no shame in wanting to kind of look at ways that you can support yourself and your family and your child. So if there's family conflict, share it so that your whole team can start to strategize in ways to help your child. But it is normal and should be expected that if there is conflict within the home, that child's behaviors are more likely to be increased. But when it is channeled, it is unyielding to what they have the potential to create. The irony, and I say this all the time, is so I do have a daughter with ADHD. I didn't know that I married a man that had ADHD until I had a daughter with ADHD. And then as I grew into an adult in all of these other areas, I find that 3 of my closest friends have ADHD, right? So vice presidents of organizations and these college professors, all of these individuals. So I clearly love the experience. I love the thinking outside the box. I love the spontaneity of it. I love the fun and the adventurous sides to it. But I think we have to be more intentional because is it a handful? Sure is at times. But it's if we tailor it and we engage it, then there are these wonderful opportunities to really help it thrive. So I'm not going to go over necessarily the signs of ADHD because I think if you think your child has ADHD, they probably do, right? But having said that, I firmly believe in a full psychological test to have that evaluated. Because what can happen is that children can feel like they have ADHD because they're cooped up in the house. They don't, but they just need to run around and they need to play. And so we see that right now during the pandemic, there's probably an increased amount of children that are supposed to exert energy. That's why they have recess in elementary school, because it's an appropriateness in regards to behavioral and developmental needs. So it might look like it, but when you have a evaluation done, what will happen is that evaluation will ask school teachers, what are you noticing? It'll ask parents, what are you noticing? It might encourage the child to participate. So it's going to ask people to see what symptoms are you noticing within the child, because ADHD is not episodic. That's trauma, right? So when you see a child that just acts out in one area, but not in all areas, that's normally more associated to trauma responses. ADHD is chronic. It's going to show up at home. It's going to show up in class. It's going to show up at the next class. It's going to show up in recess. It's going to show up in lunch, 2 of the worst places for a child with ADHD. And so it's going to show up everywhere. So everybody should be seeing something similar so that when we make an appropriate diagnosis, particularly when we're looking at appropriateness of medications, that it has been addressed properly so that we're not doing that quick, I think my child has ADHD because they're not following the directions and they're not following rules and they're hard to sit down, but they've been caught in a pandemic and they're homeschooled. Not homeschooled, you know what I'm saying? So how do we start to look at the children that do it? Again, when I'm working with them, I always kind of say they're the ones that jump into the fire without thinking. And then afterwards they're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Right? But they're the ones that are throwing the pencil in classroom. And then they're like, oh, I should not have done it. But Johnny said to throw the pencil and I did it. And I knew I shouldn't have done it. Right? Which then perseverates that idea of where they start to have questions about their own self-confidence and competence because they keep doing things that they don't know why they're doing it. They make these poor executive decision-making skills. And so they don't always necessarily think through the consequences or connect all the dots. So they do first and then think second. And part of the work in regards to treating them is to help them to get to a space where they can kind of do either that simultaneously or think first and act second. But for that child, that's sometimes why they are fun, because they're the ones that always say yes. They are oftentimes the heroes. So I always like to say that we see that a lot in first responders. And so again, when I say that there's beauty to this, there is this overwhelming sense of recognizing that we do appreciate these skills. We do want somebody to be able to put somebody before themselves. And so when we're looking at those high risk professions and those heroes in our world, we do see a correlation with ADHD. And so I'm going to encourage this for anybody that is listening, is to make sure that we're also aware success is best when they're highly stimulated. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to structure that stimulation so that they're not overtaxed and overburdened, right? We don't want them busy 90 hours a day. But if everybody remembers Michael Phelps, who was an Olympic athlete, did really, really well, trained, swam in the Olympics, one of the highest medaled Olympians in history. The year that he stopped swimming, he actually ended up with a DUI, started smoking marijuana, and ended up in a rehabilitation center. So the brain of ADHD, again, because if you think your brain's got to go to the gym all the time, where are they putting that energy? Where are they outletting that? So sometimes what happens is that when our children start to act out as a result of their ADHD, we take away the thing that they actually need the most. So we make them sit in an office because they've engaged in behaviors that are appropriate to ADHD. And now their energy level is getting worse. And so then you're unleashing them. And so the behaviors don't match because they're still needing to have those outlets. So I always like to make sure that parents are aware of that. So core issues with ADHD, again, these are some of the issues that we're going to see in regards to a child. These are, and I say these because these are expected. So these behaviors can be frustrating for a parent. These behaviors can be frustrating for a teacher. These behaviors can be frustrating within a school system. But in the same way that a symptom of depression would be sadness, high level of emotionality, crying, isolation, those are the symptoms of depression. We don't get to control the symptoms that we have in regards to the diagnoses, but we get to control how we perceive them. And oftentimes what happens is that because the sadness associated with depression taps into an empathetic part of who we are, so we tend to lean into those children. If you saw a child that looked sad or lonely or was crying, every one of us would lean into that child and help to support them to feel better. But those are their symptoms. These are the symptoms of ADHD. And so leaning into that child to help them to teach behavioral control, to teach ways of managing their own experiences is going to have the same effects as when you teach a child that has depression how to feel connected and valued. But we don't like these as much. These are a lot more frustrating. So we tend to react to the children with ADHD while we respond to the child with depression. And so I'm going to encourage you to respond to both. So I'm going to do a very brief overview of the brain. The reason why, so again, I always love talking about the brain. I'm a nerd to the brain, but I also think that when we're talking about topics that can be controversial, I don't believe in ADHD. I don't think it's a real diagnosis. I think that we're just making excuses. I think it's important for us to highlight how the brain is impacted because it takes away those opinions. This is a fact. This is exactly what happens to somebody that's been impacted with ADHD. And so when we understand how we got here, then we understand the truth to it so that we're not shaming the behaviors and we're starting to all work together in order to adjust it. So some of the three parts of the brain that I'm going to focus in a little bit more, and then I'm actually going to spend a little time on the neurotransmitters, because I think that becomes an important piece so that we can get to the treatment options. The parts of the brains that are pretty impacted in regards to how we understand a child's behavior is the frontal lobes. So we all know, and if we don't, you will in a second, the brain develops from the bottom up, from the back to the front. The last part of the brain to develop is the frontal cortex. doesn't develop all the way. So when we hear people saying they're not going to your brain doesn't fully develop until you're roughly about 26 or 27 years old, that's really what they're talking about. Your brain is there. It's just that the frontal cortex hasn't finished developing. And as a result of it, it rests more consistently on that limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain. So the frontal lobes, which is responsible for the executive functioning, for controlling our impulses, our emotion regulation, our motivation, figuring out how to organize and create sequence within our memories. So how do I know? So when you have a child that's supposed to go to a classroom, but they were supposed to stop somewhere first, and all of a sudden they're 15 minutes late to class, and they were like, I didn't mean to be late. And we assume that they're lying. Part of the lagging in their brain is that they didn't mean to be late. They actually did think that they had enough time and they just didn't get there. So that part, because it's connecting A, B, and C, they're really good at connecting A and B. It's the A, B, and C that gets the struggle. So they had good intentions, but now they're embarrassed that they got in trouble. And so they either lie, which then that gets perseverated. And we see those children that kind of continue to develop that because they're trying to protect themselves. Or they just keep saying, I don't know, and we assume they're not telling us the truth. So that lags, and we'll talk about how that happens in regards to neurochemistry. The limbic system, so I'm not going to get into the other two, not for tonight's conversation, but the limbic system is an important piece because that's the emotional center of the brain. Again, that is the part of the brain that we see. So when we think of like the terrible twos, when we think about like adolescence and why nobody wants to go back to their adolescence, it's because it was so filled with pretty strong emotions, right? Everybody notices you, you notice everybody else's experiences. The experiences are pretty raw and can be painful. And so that part of the limbic system is really kind of what's running the show. This is another part that is being interacted with in regards to ADHD. So when we talk about, again, the ideas of executive functioning, this is the frontal cortex. And so why it becomes important as well. And so I know that I'm going to be talking about ADHD, but I want to just kind of highlight that idea of ADHD's chronicness and trauma is episodic. That sometimes what happens is that when we start to talk about executive functioning, ADHD is an executive functioning disorder. It means that there is not enough neurochemicals in the part of the brain to allow for somebody to delay the gratification, to stay attentive, to stay focused, to be able to be task oriented. There's just not enough of that chemical in those moments to help them to get that. Whereas another baseline child might have enough of it. And so when you are treating ADHD, you are building those skill sets to help activate that part of the brain. Trauma, while it looks the same, because it's inattentive, because it's easily distracted, is a safety issue. So for a child that's been impacted by trauma, it's sitting in their limbic system. And so the inattentive type that would be ADHD, because the executive functioning isn't keeping them alert, it's making it harder for them to stay paying attention because there's just not enough of the neurochemistry to help. For a child with trauma, it's not an executive functioning, it's that they're hypervigilant. So they're assessing for safety. So math doesn't matter to me if I'm worried about my next meal. So the brain reorganizes to prioritize safety over math. And when we treat them the same, it actually creates a barrier, particularly for that child with trauma. So again, I'm just going to say that again, in case there's some educators on here tonight, to just be able to help with kind of that differential. If we give a child with trauma a stimulant, that child's behaviors are going to worsen because it's not an executive functioning and the stimulants are going after that executive functioning part of the brain. That's what those stimulants do. For a child with trauma, it would be like you having anxiety and me giving you 15 doses of espresso. And you're like, wow, I feel worse. That's what happens to a child's nervous system with a stimulant who has trauma. So again, child with ADHD, the executive functioning is they have the complex problem solving. A lot of teachers or not teachers, but parents can get confused because they will say, a child is hyper focused, so they don't have ADHD because they can be on their phone for 15 hours or because they're gaming all the time or because, and that doesn't that doesn't get rid of the potential that they have ADHD, because what happens with the brain of ADHD is that focus, they can become hyper focused, and the transitions can be difficult. So a child that is playing a lot of games that has ADHD, it's very difficult for them to just stop. And that's where you start seeing behavioral impacts as a result of it. So parents should not get caught on if they get hyper focused. It's oftentimes actually an indication that they are more likely to be experiencing ADHD, because the brain is seeking the stimuli. Phones and gaming are very stimulating. This is why they're a risk for substance use. They are very stimulating, because if you're texting somebody, every second your phone is ringing. And so that brain is constantly getting rewarded, and games are the same. So that's why they tend to narrow that in, different than if they're trying to read a book. All right, so I'm going to skip through the impulse control. I talked a little bit about it, but I did want to hit some of these neurotransmitters, and then I'm going to go straight into some of the interventions for families and for the schooling. So the neurotransmitters that are most associated with ADHD, this does not mean this is inclusive of the only ones, but there are some significant ones that play a role. And again, I say this so that when we have a child that's presenting in front of us, that we have compassion for, recognition that this isn't what they're choosing. Again, if you are working with children under the age of 5th grade, every day they want to do well. So we have to ask ourselves, if they are not, why? Is this ADHD, in which case this is what's happening to their brain and we need to build them skills? Or for a lot of children also, that there's a lot of family conflict or trauma at home. Every child wants to do well. There's nothing that makes me sadder than when my kids were growing up and they would come home and they'd be like, Jimmy keeps getting in trouble. And he was a little 3rd grader, and my heart would ache for him, because I was like, something's going on, because no 3rd grader wants to be bad. Kids would rather be bad than stupid. So if he feels like he's going to be stupid, he will choose bad. Or if he doesn't know how to manage himself, he will continue to engage in behaviors that later become his inner voice. So when we look at those neurotransmitters, again, norepinephrine, the lower levels that they are seeing in children with ADHD decrease their ability to sustain focus on a task, plan ahead, understand those concepts of sequence and time. And so this is where direct interventions work really well. I will say, for a child that has straight ADHD, when you do behavioral interventions, you see tremendous differences. That was one of the greatest when I would do my pro bono private practice. That was one of the most rewarding things, because I do a lot of trauma work, and so that's slow paced. But this one, I would be like 4 weeks and I look like the greatest therapist in the whole world, because I start giving them interventions, I start tailoring it, and all of a sudden they start doing well. Family loves me, kids doing well, right? So easy to catch when it's just ADHD. Right? It's going to keep popping up throughout their whole lives up until their adulthood, but it was easy to intervene. So the norepinephrine, dopamine levels. So again, those lower levels appear to be linked with the impulsivity and the risk taking. This is what makes them also highest risk for substance use later on, because of that seeking the reward. So their brain needed a higher level of stimulation than somebody else's to get the same reward. So we all seek and engage in behaviors that reward us. For somebody with ADHD, they have to seek higher behaviors, jumping out of an airplane, swimming with sharks, right? So when they experiment with substances, their brain responds like it's fireworks, whereas somebody else's would just be like, I was all right. And then serotonin. So when we talk about the mood dysregulation, kind of the difficulty with transitions, serotonin, there is lower levels of serotonin in a child with ADHD, which affects their sleep, which can affect their aggression, the shifting of attention. So when you have little tiny ones who have ADHD and everybody's like, clean up, everybody clean up. And you got that one little child that's like, I'm not done my castle. And you're like, we're all done. You need to do the castle. He's not done. His brain is not going to shift. He needs to finish the castle. So while you have to recreate structurally inappropriate interventions in the classroom, it's then trying to help set it the next day, because every time he builds that castle, he's going to act like this. So we can preventatively start to say, how do we set a timer for you? How do we renegotiate? How do we figure out things that you can successfully complete? Because when you ask a child to not complete something with ADHD, they are likely to then become aggressive, and that's where they'll fight you, right? You're trying to get him to sit down and all the other kids, but now all the kids are looking at him as he's like, I just need to finish my castle. I won't go over that. So here we go. We've got a couple more minutes. So school and family role, I can't overemphasize partnership, the engagement of the family members and the schools to be able to partner together, to be able to see what each person is seeing so you can reinforce the same behaviors, because consistency and structure are one of the most important things for a child with ADHD. These are all the vulnerabilities that we had talked about in regards to defensiveness, feeling dumb, feeling humiliated, feeling embarrassed, increased risks of addiction. So it is worth the investment, particularly the younger you are. Marijuana, I just kind of mentioned, it goes after the same part of the brain. So this is one of the highest drugs of choice for somebody with ADHD, because it quite literally helps them to calm down. But it reinforces the brain in a way that we're not trying to reinforce, and it increases the risk of addiction. So what can we do within the schools? Again, having the child sit up front. If you think about the way that the brain operates, part of the cortex is supposed to be able to weed out all of the distractions. So I can hear a bird in the back of my head and also pay attention to my teacher. If you are a child with the ADHD, you are like, what's that bird doing? And you're looking over your shoulder to see what the bird is doing. And the teacher is now irrelevant. And so you want them to be in an environment where there's the least amount of distractions. Even considering the air conditioner, right? So never by a window. They should never be in the back of a class. And even an air conditioner can be very distracting for a smaller child. Allow cool off periods. So that should be a part of their accommodations. Encouraging the younger they are and the more comfortable they learn to ask for help. Children with ADHD are going to need to have help. They're going to need to know that this isn't an embarrassment for them, and that it's okay to ask for help discreetly for most of them, which is what they would prefer. So this is a great time to start encouraging it and rewarding it. The behavioral systems, so a reward system tends to work really well with them. Short rewards, you tell a child with ADHD, if you're good by the end of the week, no shot, particularly the little ones with ADHD. It's too long and they can't do it. So when you start to narrow it down for them and give them concrete skills that they can utilize to do well, they tend to do well. I will say that children with ADHD are incredibly bright. If they are given the skills, they tend to want to use them because they also want to please in the same way that all children do. But if you just ask them to do something without a skill, they can't do it and then they get frustrated. Being calm helps to keep their brain calm. Again, when I talked about that limbic system, their brain sits in that limbic system a little too much. So when we get very emotional, they get worse, as we all do, but in a different way in regards to somebody with ADHD. So here are some of the accommodations that work really well for our children in the school. And again, I'm not going to go over these. You will be able to have access to them. But when we talk about families, for our families, particularly during a pandemic, when kids are sitting in front of a computer for 6 to 8 hours or however your school is working it, it becomes incredibly important to give little breaks. Fidgets are great for kids with ADHD, not fidget spinners. Those are actually toys and incredibly distracting. So I do not recommend a fidget spinner, but there's a lot of different types of fidgets that work really well for a child that has ADHD. That's just a sensory experience. Giving them a special quiet spot in the house. So when everybody is now working from home, you have to be able to help a child to succeed by putting them somewhere where they're not isolated from everybody else, because that feels lonely, but where there's less distractions for them to be able to succeed. Physical activity has been linked to almost as effective as being prescribed medication. So for children with ADHD, being active is incredibly important and healthy for the brain. Creating structures that they can rely on. Limiting your outside distractions becomes incredibly important. Again, we are also in the midst of a pandemic, and so my family has got everybody home. I got my husband who has ADHD. We all have had to actually isolate because it's too distracting. Me working from home is now overwhelmingly distracting for my husband, who keeps popping in on me. So recognizing that and creating safe spaces for people to be able to do those things. Here's what not to do, and then I'm going to end it on that. Some of the other slides are the psychostimulants, and I can briefly talk about that, or if somebody has a question about it, but I want to be mindful of the time. Things that don't work for children with ADHD. maybe you could argue not for most children, but definitely not for children with ADHD, telling them to try harder, as I had mentioned. Lecturing the child about their real abilities, because in the moment they're doing the best that they can. So providing them skills as opposed to aspirations is a lot more tangible where they can move towards it. Shaming the child for the behaviors. I want you to keep thinking to yourself, would you shame a child that couldn't read and keep yelling at them to read the book the way all the other children are reading? You wouldn't. You would engage in new ways to have that child learn how to read so that they felt competent and confident. And so that is the same way that we have to do with children with ADHD. Compare that child to anybody else. If only you did that like Johnny. Johnny seems to be just fine when he reads his book because the child doesn't know why he can't do it the same way. He knows that he can't, but he doesn't know why. And so that perpetuates that shame. That's where the comorbidity of depression and anxiety is. Noticing only the negative's going to be there. That's where I said earlier on, if I'm being fully transparent, ADHD makes you not such a great parent sometimes. So you have to be more intentional in highlighting the behaviors that you want to see and be prepared that there's going to continue to be behaviors that you don't want. I used to say to my daughter all the time, I can't even predict some of the things you're going to do because it's so outside of my brain. I don't even see those things. I didn't even know that was going to be a possibility. So making sure you're highlighting the positive. Yelling increases the symptomatology of the behaviors. Chaos is one of the worst things for a child with ADHD because it increases it and because it pushes it further down in that limbic system. So with that, I'm going to pause. It is 7:50. Did you want me to pause to take questions? I don't know how you wanted me to.
That would be great. I mean, we have a question right now that we can give to you, and then we can kind of go from there. What are some ways to determine the difference between ADHD and trauma in a student? So, without knowing if they've, I guess, experienced a specific
history. Yeah. So I always pay attention to, again, the chronicness of the behavior. So is the child relatively the same every day? So there's certain expectations. Certainly things can kind of bump around. But when you have a child that comes into school and one day they are really inattentive and really acting out, and other days that they're fully engaged, paying attention, then it's more likely that there's something else going on than ADHD. ADHD follows them around. It's coming with them everywhere. But you will see the differences. If you see a child that seems to get triggered by certain things, ADHD can increase in symptomatology based on kind of the environment, but it's oftentimes not like a 0 to 10. So when you see a child that gets triggered by stuff, interactions with its peers, interactions when there is discipline, child discipline, and there's these big blow-ups, then it's always one of those things that you say, let me pay attention. Let me see if that's what's going on. And that might be where you're able to then kind of reach out to see if there's other things that might potentially go on. But that would be the best way without having a history of a child. It really is if they're, when somebody comes in and they're presenting differently on different days, then you're more inclined to believe that there's triggers that are occurring behind the scenes that you don't know. Children with ADHD also tend to get themselves in trouble more frequently in like your lunch and your recess consistently because it's too unstructured. So they tend to get themselves into a little bit more trouble, like pretty much every day. So hopefully that helps to answer a little bit.
Yes, thank you. I also had a question. As a parent, could you give some advice or feedback on, I mean, obviously there are going to be behaviors and things that come up with like discipline or consequences are necessary, but how to like be mindful of like this is their ADHD at play, like, and not, like how do you determine an appropriate while still like recognizing that it isn't always their fault, but still manage the behavior in the home? Or from this behavior from the school that you heard about from the teacher, Right.
Well, and I think, again, it's opportunities to have conversations about how do we get here, right? So I'm going to back up to kind of have I'm going to share with you a story of a child that I had that had ADHD, right? So they're coming to see me because he's not doing great, right, in school and elsewhere. But again, ADHD to its beauty, all of a sudden things pop in line, everything's doing well, right? I look like a terrific therapist. And then they come in one day and I see everybody is super angry. And I'm like, ruh-roh. And so I say, what's going on? And mom says, he's regressed. Everything has gone backwards. He's doing everything wrong again. And so we start to ask the why. Well, I do, right? He's already defensive with mom because they've already gotten into this conflict. And so I asked, what had happened. And so the short end of this story is he was only allowed an hour a day of gaming because he can't shut down. So it was interfering with his schooling. So he could only do an hour of gaming on the weekends. Everybody agreed, including the child. He was given his hour. He had done a good week. He was given his hour when mom left the house. When he got onto his computer needed to be updated. And so it was saying it was going to take him 45 minutes. So what he did is he went up into the attic, he rerouted the modem to give all of the juices. So took all of the juice from all of the other computers, stuck it all to his computer so that his computer would update in less than 15 minutes. And then, as all good children with ADHD do, he forgot. So when mom came home, she was angry because he had rerouted everybody's computer to his computer and he didn't admit it. So the long story of that is that was genius. That's not worth punishing. That's the thinking outside of the box. That is genius. But we can't have you doing these things and we don't want you lying. So what we started to talk about is if you get a child that has gotten into trouble at school, help to experience, to give them space to say what's happening, because you might start hearing them saying there's too many kids at recess and this keeps happening to me, because normally the children with ADHD are the ones that are getting blamed. They're the loudest. So when you create some of the space, listen, if you hit another kid, there's consequences. We're not getting you out of the consequences, but in the story, you might actually be able to hear what happened before that. There's where your intervention is. The intervention is in the impulsive moment because the impulse is happening, but it's a learning opportunity for the next time. So if you see a behavior at home, you're going to consequent it, but you don't have to be angry at it. My daughter actually just texted. We have a group text with my 3 daughters. And I found like a funny meme and I sent it to everybody. And my oldest daughter literally texted and she was like, I was always grounded hanging out with mom and dad. So we always watch TV or whatever. So consequences stayed, but I didn't have to shame her for it. So here she is, a grown adult now, 24, that's saying, oh yeah, no, we ordered pizza and watched a movie every Friday night because I was grounded all the time. And so you can help them build the resources by giving them space, because what I will say, everybody with ADHD, it makes sense as to why they're doing it when you give them space to try and work through it. Here's this kid that rerouted everything and mom was so angry, and I get it, but it made sense. He was thinking outside of the box, but I can't have you keep doing this. So what else could you have done? And then it was, I could have called mom. Okay, so then that's a great skill. So what if the next time something like that happens, can you call mom and ask for permission first? That never occurred to him. So you're not removing the consequences. Consequences work. So we're not removing them, but we're using it as an opportunity to say, what else could we do the next time so that this doesn't keep repeating for you? Because I know you want to do this differently.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Not seeing any others in the Q&A. So I'll give people like another minute just in case they think of one and want to send it in.
So the only thing that I will say while we are waiting, if there's anybody that wants to ask that last question, and again, everybody can have access to this, is that there are effective treatments for ADHD. What I will say is stimulants do work for children that actually have ADHD. They don't work for children that don't. But if you have it, but I will say, a child being given a stimulant is not sufficient enough because they still haven't learned the skills. So in the same way that if you were to give somebody insulin, and if you have a child that has this medication, these are constant conversations, because when they get into middle school and high school, they want to stop taking their medication, especially if they start experimenting with marijuana. And so the skill building is equally as important as any medication regimen, because what it allows is for them to start understanding what they need to do and how they need to do it. So in the same way, if you were using insulin as a diabetic, but you continued to eat donuts and hot dogs every single day, this isn't that the insulin's not working, it's that you're still engaging in a lifestyle that's not supporting it, and the insulin's not enough. Giving stimulants is just not enough if they're not building their skills. So the combination is a lot more effective. And that's what you'll hear family members and children say eventually. It didn't work anymore. It did. It's just you weren't doing any of these other things. It's not even the right slide. Sorry. There it is.
Great, thank you. So we do not see any more questions.
Okay.
Last call, I guess we're good. Christine or any of the panelists, do you have any questions, or are we good?
No, again, I just think it was such a wonderful presentation. So many great takeaways as parents, as educators. Thank you so much, Trish.
Yes,
Absolutely, my pleasure.
I couldn't write fast enough for many of the things that you were saying. So I'm really good this is recorded so that I can go back and definitely watch it again. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.